And we are live today, back, or not actually back, starting by popular demand. There was a huge outcry, emails, get Randal Rauser. We need to hear from Randal Rauser. How come you haven't interviewed Randal Rauser? So today, by overwhelming emails, overwhelming phone calls, we have Randal Rauser. Woo! So, Mr. Rauser, do you want to introduce yourself to my channel and tell us who you are and what you do?
Well, it's good to be here. I'm a professor at Taylor Seminary in Edmonton, Canada, where I've been for 17 years. Teach systematic theology, church history, apologetics, and worldview. Written, I think, 12 books in a range of areas. But one of the common themes is apologetics and theology. And did my doctoral work in England, focusing on Reformed epistemology and its interrelationship with theological method. So that's an interesting thing to me.
Yeah,
and I like to do a lot of debates and stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I noticed that. Reformed epistemology, when we get into the substance, is going to be a lot of what I'm asking you about, because I've watched some of your videos on it, and your knowledge of it is pretty thorough. Did you actually write a book on that particular topic or something thereabouts?
Well, I did my doctoral thesis at the University of London, King's College in England from 99 to 2002. And so I focused on Reformed epistemology, in particular Plantinga's version of it, and bringing that into dialogue with theological method. And a later version of that was published, like a very different version of it was published in 2009 by Oxford University Press, called Theology in Search of Foundations. So that's probably the most thorough treatment. And then it also appears at a more popular level in some of my other books.
Right, and you bring it up a few times in your videos. Now, so have you been a Christian your whole life? Let's just do a general, get a sense of your background.
Yeah, I actually wrote a book called What's So Confusing About Grace, which is something of a theological autobiography. And in that book, I tell the story of having a conversion when I was probably 5 years old. So I came from a Pentecostal background in Canada, and it's part of a conversionist tradition in the Protestant tradition, which is this idea that you have to know the day you were saved. And so my parents were telling me, you got to choose, is it going to be God or the devil? And so I said, okay, I'll choose to follow God because Satan seems to be bad news. And so I would place that at age of 5. So was I converted then? If I'd died the day before that conversion experience, would I have been lost forever? Well, those are interesting theological questions, but yes, I would put that approximately 43 years ago.
Wow, so that's interesting. And then, so you've been a Christian the whole time. Did you ever entertain doubts, or did you ever have a period of struggle or walking away or anything like that? Dark night of the soul?
Uh-oh, I think we might have lost him. Hopefully. I've seen before he sometimes has internet issues during his videos.
Oh, does he really?
Oh, there he is. He's back.
Did he?
Did he frozen?
Yeah.
We froze you out. We weren't crazy about the first answer, so we decided to punish you for the second answer. Did you hear the question?
Yeah. Say it again. I mean, I was answering it, but now that I'm off my stride.
Did you have any periods of struggle or doubt or dark night of the soul or anything where you wrestled with your faith at all?
I mean, I've always been a questioner. I'm not the kind of person that has like deep existential doubts, but I'm always questioning, challenging, and it's been a theological journey. So I grew up in a fundagelical tradition background, so very conservative theologically, and so I was like young earth creationist in high school, that kind of thing, and fighting all those battles. And I gradually moved on to, I would say, brighter horizons. So I've always been questioning and exploring. My latest book is actually on those kinds of themes, but I don't have existential doubts. But I do question, and I've had many theological changes over the years. So, for example, I was a Calvinist for about 3 years. And then I decided I'm not a Calvinist anymore. And it wasn't neither one of those decisions was like a trite thing. I mean, those were close, careful, theologically reasoned processes, but some people figure everything out when they're like a kid and then they never change. And I'm not that person. I've had many theological developments and changes over the years.
What would you say is the genesis of those? Prayerfully considering, or people convincing you, or from research, or how's those come about?
I think that the main catalyst comes from a commitment to Steelman alternative views. So people are often more familiar with the complement term straw man. To straw man a view that you don't agree with is to rebut a weaker version of the view that's contrary to yours, and then treat that as if it's the strongest expression of the view. And so that's straw manning. Steel manning is the opposite. It's to make an alternative view to yours look as strong as it can possibly be. And so I've committed to steel manning. I've tried to commit to steel manning. And in part because I think that that's, among other things, that's just good neighborliness. That you would, if you're supposed to treat other people the way that you want to be treated, you should treat their ideas the way you'd want your ideas to be treated. One of the consequences of consistently steel manning is that you're going to put yourself at greater risk of changing your views over time. And I think that that's just been a practical consequence of my discipline.
Yeah, that's one of a mutual friend of John and I's is an atheist, and he's more open-minded and more open to conversations than most atheists, or a big chunk of them. And one of the things he said is that's the risk, is that when you start having open conversations with people, you do run the risk that you're going to be influenced by, you're at least going to be influenced by them a little and potentially change your mind. So how would you rate yourself now as, like, are you kind of a conservative theologically, liberal theologically? Where do you stand on the spectrum?
I think that we have to, first of all, take all those terms with a grain of salt, because they're certainly relative terms. Right. Conservative is a relative term, because if you call yourself a conservative, there are people who think you're a liberal, because relative to your theology, they are.
Exactly.
And so it goes the other way as well.
In terms of in politics, my wife thinks she's like a total like red state conservative, and we live in Southern California. And I'm like, yeah, if we moved to Oklahoma, she'd be considered a Democrat.
I think, and similarly of Canada to the US. So, I mean, up here, everybody believes in national, not-for-profit healthcare. That's just part of the water that we drink. But of course, if you, and it's much more uncommon to think that access to firearms is something that is intrinsic to freedom. But if you go south of the border, a person that up here would be considered conservative would probably be a raving liberal communist, depending on where you are. So yes, and same thing theologically. And the other thing that I would just add before I actually finally answer your question is that it's additionally complex, because people can be very sort of quote unquote conservative on one view and yet liberal or progressive on another view. So I know some people that are very conservative in aspects of their theology relative to a particular theological tradition, but they don't believe in historical Adam, for example. And so that stands out as an anomaly in a sense. And they can reason through their position, but are they conservative or liberal? Well, actually, you have to say, relative to this doctrine, they're more conservative or traditional, but relative to this one, they're more progressive. So it does get very complicated very quickly. And I like to give that as a caveat, because often what people do with labels like that is they use it to box you in. So say, okay, so we know where you're coming from. Well, actually, maybe you don't, right? So with that all being said, I would tend to call myself a progressive evangelical, knowing that evangelical has a lot of baggage and the term progressivism has a lot of baggage as well. But that's generally how I would label myself.
It's interesting, because I almost would label you like that too, because what little I know about you, your views on like scripture, as far as I can tell, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just guessing, are a little bit more liberal than average. But you are definitely committed to like arguments and debates and like apologetics, and like you're out there fighting the fight. So in some senses, I think that term works in terms of how you operate in the space. Like you're kind of both.
Yeah.
That's how I see it anyways.
Yeah.
So okay, so now you've written books and you're fairly to very committed to theology, right? And you're pretty, how would you rate yourself as a Christian in terms of, seems to be a really central part of your life, everything about Christianity and theology. And am I getting that right?
Yes, I mean, if you're a seminary professor and that's your day job, then you end up, of necessity, of course, just thinking about theological issues all the time. I mean, I'm quite active, I would say, in my church as well. So Christianity, a Christian worldview, Christian community, Christian subculture are all things that very much structure my daily life and my way of being in the world.
Right. The one thing I want to ask you before I start getting into the other topics, didn't you have a tweet out about the coolest bands? Wasn't that you? And you had like what, Zeppelin and Metallica, I think. Am I remembering this correctly? You had a question.
Sounds like
a
it
survey
rings a
tweet.
bell. Yeah, that sounds like it rings a bell. Yeah, I remember that.
And
I'm
I
trying to think
tweeted the
who-
Clash, but I don't remember your response.
Oh,
I actually don't.
yeah. I think I responded to that about the Ramones, saying something about but because I remember the Clash coming up. It is true, like, because this idea of coolness is not an uninteresting property, because coolness is not something that seems to be, ironically enough, it isn't something that seems to be ephemeral. In other words, it doesn't disappear quickly. Even the term
Right.
cool has an enduring property about it. People use it generation after
Totally.
generation, where they don't use rad or they don't use groovy. Those things died out, but cool is, or even sick, right? Like, I think 10 years ago, it was common to call things sick. I don't know if we call them sick anymore, but cool endures. And so similarly, it's interesting that certain pop cultural icons, U2 is an
Endure.
obvious example, they just rise above and they
Johnny
endure.
Cash is probably the penultimate example, because he's like the total cool package for 40 or some odd years.
I think Johnny Cash was in the survey in my poll, because I got like 4 disparate ones. So I think it was like Metallica, Johnny Cash, and a couple of ones. Because you're right, it's like, or from country music, Willie Nelson is another one he's always kind of cool, even though he's in his 80s now. And Led Zeppelin, I mean, they're cool. So it is a kind of, what is it that makes certain artists cool? Frank Sinatra, I think, was in the other one I listed.
Yeah,
people who
totally.
know
Well, with
Frank
Johnny-
Sinatra. Yeah, go ahead.
With Johnny Cash, it had a lot to do with authenticity. It was like he made no pretense about what he was. So he was totally
Yeah.
unauthentically what he was everywhere he went. Even when he became an evangelical Christian, he's the only person who made that somewhat cool. He would go play like worship songs at places, and it was actually cool. It was Johnny Cash.
Well,
So-
now, see, the interesting thing is that what philosophers, of course, they do, certainly analytic philosophers, is they try to analyze concepts and get down to the essence conceptually of what is at the heart of a concept. So 15 years ago, during the Gulf War and weapons of mass destruction, there was a lot of talk about how the Bush administration and government had been manipulating intelligence. And people were talking about the word bullshit a lot, and how do you define bullshit? And there's actually a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who published a book on that.
Oh yeah,
Actually
I know him.
It was
John
repackaged
Vervaeke
as an
talks
essay.
about him all the time.
Yeah, so it's in his little book on bullshit, he analyzes the concept of bullshit and says bullshit is distinct from lying, in that when you lie, you want to mislead people as to the nature of truth. When you bullshit, you don't really care whether what you say is false or not. You just want to use language to manipulate people and get a particular effect. And that's what makes it different from lying. So a salesman doesn't lie to you. The salesman bullshits and tries to get you to buy the product, whether what he says is true or not. Now, to come back to cool, I think you're getting at conceptually, what is it that makes something cool? And one of the things, you're right, is authenticity. You are not cool, like no cover band is ever cool. I mean, it's not that they're
never.
uncool. They can do what they do well, and you can respect them for that, but they will never be the original artist because they're a copy. But what makes the original artist legitimate and cool and enduring is that they are not posers, they are trailblazers. Johnny Cash was always authentic. He didn't have to pretend to be. And this is one of the things that really bothers me about, just to get on a hobby horse, like kids today. I know I'm getting old when I'm talking about kids today. But you know, when like
Awesome.
young people today, they buy
with their
like
TikTok
jeans
and their TikTok dances.
Yeah,
In
well,
my
everything
day,
is
we
fake.
had MySpace.
Everything has a filter on social media. And when you buy your jeans, you buy them distressed and they're already shredded from the mall, whereas we had to earn our holes growing up. I mean, I have a pair of jeans that have holes in it because I was in a motorcycle accident. Now that's authentic. I mean, that's cool,
that's
right? Because
cool.
I earned those holes. So that's I think cool is an interesting concept.
Yeah, I agree. Now, did you what was the explanation on you wrote your dissertation on Reformed epistemology? Is that correct? Is that what you told me? And that you what exactly makes it Reformed epistemology? Is that word tied to Calvinism like it sounds? Give us the background of it.
It is, but I think in some ways the link is somewhat incidental.
Okay, that's
so
what I thought.
It comes from, but it is like it's called that because it's Reformed. It's not because it's just a change, but because it comes out of the Dutch Calvinist, a group of Dutch Calvinist philosophers, and in particular, Alvin Plantinga was the most important one.
Yeah, right.
And secondarily, Nicholas Wolderstorff, another one, George Mavrodes. So they collectively published a collection of essays called Faith and Rationality in 1983, but it really originated. The genesis of it comes, I would say, in 1967. So that's going back a while when Alvin Plantinga published his second book, his first fully written book called God and Other Minds. And yeah, so I know I don't want to give you the long history here, but I'll just say that what makes it Reformed is that Plantinga, in his argument, he appeals to one aspect of John Calvin's theology, where John Calvin talks about this idea of a sensus divinitatis, in Latin, just meaning the sense of the divine, or an ability to perceive God through nature. And Calvin talks about how God gave us this cognitive faculty to perceive him through nature. And then Plantinga explores that idea as part of the foundation of his epistemology. And that's what makes it Reformed in that sense.
Right. And there's the reason why I was so interested in it. I watched your video on the census demonitis. And I watched you in the debate with Matt Dillahunty and T Jump. I've actually been I was on T Jump's channel. He interviewed me. And there's a lot to say. There's a lot to say about Reformed epistemology. So I don't even know where to start, because the Plantinga, it was kind of revolutionary with Plantinga, correct? In that it was the first. Like, he talks about a belief being properly basic. That originated with him. Am I right about that? A religious belief. The census demonitis is something that, tell me if I get this wrong, is something you're perceiving God as a person, and your perception of God is actually assuming it corresponds to a real thing, that you can now define that belief as properly basic. In other words, it doesn't need any foundation underneath it. It's like is that kind of what it is?
Kind of, yeah. The way you said it, you said if it corresponds. And one of the things is that for something to be properly basic, just has to mean that it meets certain criteria for rationality or warrant or justification, but not necessarily that it's true.
Okay.
And so the idea of it corresponding is not necessary for it to be properly basic, because properly.
Uh-oh,
we lost him again.
did he cut out?
Yeah. We've got a full chat now. We've got Gavin.
Ultimately want to get to knowledge.
There we go.
Okay.
You cut out again, Randal. You're just explaining what a properly basic belief is.
All right. I'm not sure why that is, but we'll roll with it. So, okay. So Did I just, yeah, let me
properly
talk
basic.
Yeah.
Properly basic, what you're saying, I'm used to, because I deal with atheists so much, always caveating, assuming it's true. But you're saying that properly basic, it's not necessarily about whether that's a true belief. It's just rationally justified by the believer. Is that what you just said before you cut out?
Yeah. So for example, if you look out the window and you see a giant floating balloon like that in the shape of a hippo, let's just make this nice and memorable, and it floats by your house, you are rationally justified in believing that, right? And because it's a sense perceptual belief and you have an experience, you form an immediately justified belief. Now, it's unusual, but it's not so out of the norm that you'd have to have some additional evidence to believe it. You just accept your deliverances of your sense perception. But it is possible that you're hallucinating.
Right.
So you could be wrong. You may not be seeing a large floating hippo, but if you appear to, then all things being equal, it would seem you're justified to believe it. It could be properly basic for you.
Right. So if you, all things being equal, if you did a check on yourself and you said, like, am I drunk? Am I high right now? And you're not. Did I get enough sleep? And you did. And you check with your wife. Am I crazy? Am I speaking plain English? And she's like, you're fine. You seem normal. Then you can accept, okay, there's a what did you say was a floating pink hippo balloon outside? Correct?
Yeah. So I actually have what I'm saying from your description, because the way that you're describing it is that I would actually only be justified in believing I'm seeing this floating balloon if I went through this evidential reasoning process where I talked to my wife and I made sure I'm not hallucinating in that. And I'm actually saying, no, I mean, if I look up the window, I do see things floating by every once in a while that look unusual. And so if I did see a balloon, I could just believe I'm seeing a balloon without going through that whole process you're talking about.
Right. I'm always doing that because I'm always listening for the atheist. So like, in order to, because ultimately what we're trying to tie this back to is giving a rational justification for our beliefs. And I think that Planage's avenue of exploration, the reason why I keep going back to it is I think it's ultimately really strong because it's how I became a Christian. I went to a church and had an experience that I was pretty darn sure was God. And if an atheist did that tomorrow, they'd either be a liar or a believer. You don't really have that many options. If you honestly feel like, wait, this does feel like God to me, what are your choices past that? That's why I always go back to it, because I think it's ultimately a really strong, compelling argument. Go ahead.
Yes, that's good. So I think like the big objection, let's just get it out of the way then, if we're talking about having the invisible atheists in the room, the big objection, probably the most common one anyway, is special pleading. Well, you're engaging some kind of special pleading, you want to get some exception for your God experience. What I want to say, and what Reformed epistemology does, and what Plantinga did, is say, no, that's not what we're doing at all. In fact, what he did, the culmination of Plantinga's work, in 1993, he published 2 books. One was called Warrant, the Current Debate, and then another one, Warrant and Proper Function. So in Warrant, the Current Debate, what Plantinga does is he says, well, I'm going to talk about these concepts of rationality, justification, knowledge, and warrant. And warrant is like justification. It's something you add to true belief to make it knowledge, essentially. So he looks at all the philosophers in the early 1990s and all of their theories about what knowledge is and how you achieve warrant. And he points out the problems, the flaws with each one of them. And so it's basically a deconstructive book. He's saying everybody got it wrong. In Warrant and Proper Function, Plantinga offers a sequel where he gives his own theory. His own theory is to say that we need to understand the nature of warrant, or the way that you acquire something like justification that you add to true belief in order to get knowledge. We need to understand that as arising out of proper function, that human beings are designed to acquire true beliefs under certain circumstances when our cognitive faculties are working properly in the right maximal and minimal epistemic environments. That's sort of the big picture he gives us. He reasons through every one of those points. And then he comes to his conclusions. So warrant, you achieve it through proper function, and acquiring properly basic beliefs, and then non-basic beliefs as well. And then 7 years later, into the year 2000, he publishes Warranted Christian Belief, which now takes his theory of warrant and applies it to Christian belief and shows how you can have warranted Christian belief, just like what you're describing in terms of your religious experience. So the important thing to appreciate is that this is not special pleading. What he did was he began by showing how every other epistemological theory in the field is flawed or limited in some way. He offers a solution, an alternative theory, and then that theory provides the basis for his own epistemology and ultimately for his Christian warranted belief.
So what can you summarize the flaws, or is that just too complicated given how many epistemological theories we might be covering? Uh-oh, cut out again?
Well, it seems like your mic stopped working, Randall. Oh.
Yeah, that was a mic. He didn't actually disappear that time.
And now he's frozen. Oh, you're back, but now we can hear you. Okay.
Okay. We're gonna roll with it. Okay, so you've got foundationalist theories, and you've got coherentist theories, and you've got pragmatic theories, among others.
Right.
The coherentist theories, you can have coherentist theories of justification, of knowledge, of truth. Same thing with foundationalism. So in terms of justification, the idea is, well, you can be justified if you have a particular belief formed in a particular context and it's coherent with all your other beliefs. And Plantinga shows how there are various weaknesses and inadequacies with the coherentist view. Now, in terms of foundationalism, there are two big types of foundationalism. So there's what we call classical foundationalism or strong foundationalism, and moderate foundationalism, and Plantinga is a moderate foundationalist, as am I. So the classic or strong foundationalist, they begin with an assumption that anything which is properly basic needs to be certain. So you could not be wrong about it. So this is an epistemology that is really rooted back in the philosophy of René Descartes in the 16th, 17th century. So yeah, the 1630s maybe. And then after him, John Locke. But then Plantinga's approach, and through Wollerstorff as well, it's really rooted more in another philosopher, Thomas Reid, who's often called the Scottish common sense realist. Okay, so the classical foundationalists like Descartes and that, they said you need to have certainty in your foundations, because if you don't have certainty, then you can't have anything. And so then.
Oh gosh.
Uh-oh. There's a
darn, that was he was
I know. This is like my bread and butter. I'm like, there you are. You cut out again for a second there. You're talking about Thomas Reid. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the strong foundationalist says you have to have certainty in your foundations. And so then they limit the foundations to a very limited number of beliefs. So for example, they would say that a belief has to be self-evident or has to be indefeasible. Self-evident belief might be 2 + 2 = 4. An indefeasible belief, in other words, a belief you could not be wrong about, would be, I seem to see a balloon. Right? We were talking about balloons a minute ago.
Right, okay.
So what the classic foundationalist would say is, you cannot have as a properly basic belief, I see a balloon. What you can have as properly basic is, I seem to see a balloon.
I believe I see a balloon.
I believe I see a balloon. I seem to see a balloon. I am being appeared to balloonly. Sometimes people have these awkward descriptions.
Yeah, that's it. I'm being appeared to balloonly.
How do you move? The challenge for the classical foundationalist is, how do you move from that, I appear to, in order to actually saying something about the world itself? Like, I can know or rationally believe that there is a balloon I'm seeing. And that's one of the problems with classical foundationalism. Another problem is that classical foundationalism appears to have a self-reference problem, because the claim that your foundations must be limited to this subset of beliefs, if you're to be justified in believing that, that too needs to ultimately derive from something which is foundational, with other words, which is self-evident or indefeasible. But there doesn't seem to be any way to argue that claim is indefeasible, or that can be drawn or reasoned from beliefs that are self-evident or indefeasible. So, so that's a big problem for people like Descartes and classical foundationalists. Plantinga's approach, and from people like Thomas Reid before him, is to take a particularist approach to identifying what beliefs can be properly basic. So he says, you look at the way that people generally form beliefs, and you treat those as innocent until proven guilty. So for example, people typically form beliefs through sense perception, right? As we gave the example of the balloon,
Right.
Through rational intuition. So yeah, it just seems to, for example, you say, nothing can be red and blue all over.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I'll take the blame for this. I must be my having set it up and then his connecting to Canada. You cut out again, right? At talking about having a rational intuition regarding like something cannot be both red and blue all over.
Okay. This is really frustrating. I'm sorry, I don't know what the problem is with the Wi-Fi here. But
well, I mean, the information you're giving us is really good. So
then every time there's a pause, it'll just, every time I freeze, it'll just be a moment for us to ruminate and reflect. We'll treat it like that.
Well, that's what I've been treating it as, because the stuff you're giving us actually almost we don't know, and almost nobody in my audience knows. So yeah, it's really good information, and you're explaining it very clearly. So if you're not getting frustrated with it, I'm not at all.
Yeah, so. No, I can roll with it. So so nothing can be red and blue all over. That seems to be something that we know through what we call rational intuition. You just can see that it must be the case. And so that's just this fascinating way of knowing things. Or the fact that you can know that 7 + 5 = 12 is a necessary statement, that it must always be true. We know that through rational intuition. So yes, that can be properly basic. Some other things that can be properly basic are testimony. So for example, if you want to know what the time is and you're walking along, you say to some stranger, hey, can you tell me what the time is? He looks at his wrist and he says, oh, it's 4:32. Can you form the belief that it is 4:32 based upon that testimony? Yes, you can. So at least in some cases, testimony can clearly be a source of properly basic belief. Another source of properly basic belief is memory. You wake up in the morning and you remember that you had a pizza for dinner the night before. Can you know that you had pizza for dinner before based upon that memory? Yes. Again, you could be wrong about any one of these things. But at least when we're talking about warrant and justification, yes, you could be warranted and justified in believing you had pizza for dinner until and unless there's some overwhelming evidence to show that you are misremembering. So memory is flawed, rational intuition is flawed, sense perception is flawed. All of these things are flawed, but all things being equal, we can form properly basic belief in this manner.
Until you have a strong defeater. So you would say that the belief is basically innocent until proven guilty by something that overrides, like yes. the guy who told you what time it is just turns around and kills somebody, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, this guy might be crazy, and then you see a big clock that says it's 2 hours later than what he said, and you're like, oh, he's wrong, and like
yeah.
So in the face now, how does this work in terms of? I only saw you in the one debate, and you were kind of trying to use this in the debate, correct? I mean, as far as I saw, you were bringing up the movie Contact, and you were trying to use this in the course of the debate. But how does this generally roll with you when the when you are trying to use this in real time?
Yeah, so in that, I believe it was the Dillahunty jump debate, I talked about testimony.
Right.
And so this is where I do differ certainly in practical method from Plantinga or some other Reformed epistemologists, that I will tend to focus on testimony as a mundane, properly basic way of forming justified or warranted Christian belief. And I do that for a couple reasons. One reason is because of my ecclesiology. I just have a high emphasis upon the role of the church in forming justified, warranted beliefs in other human beings.
Right.
But another reason, and probably the more important reason from an apologetic perspective, is that this avoids, again, the charge of special pleading, because you can say, hey, I'm not invoking any sort of unique properties here.
Yeah.
Time to reflect.
Avoid the charge of special pleading. I'm reflecting on that.
Yeah.
So he's not invoking unique properties.
Guilty.
Yeah,
Am I frozen again?
Yeah, just
you froze for a minute. Right on. You said you're avoiding special pleading when you focus on testimony because you're not focusing on unique properties. That was the last sentence.
Perfect. Okay. So yes. So in that way, you can show that just as you can look at your watch and form the properly basic belief it is 4:32. Then if you hear, let's say you go to a church as an unchurched person, you hear the Christianity preached, and you just find yourself being persuaded by the truth of what the preacher has said, and you come to believe it's true, you can also be rational and warranted in that. Now, again, this is prima facie. So this is at face value, you can be justified or warranted. You could be wrong. And so the atheological apologist could now come along and give you some reason to doubt the preacher, to argue, to show Christianity is false. But that's where the apologist can come in and defeat those defeaters and show, no, you were perfectly justified and you continue to be justified in accepting the testimony of the preacher and the church. Now with Plantinga, he adds his focus back to Calvin on the census divinitatis as well as the role of the Holy Spirit. And so when he does that, he's adding on to his picture of epistemology more than you would get in the standard individual. So I think that's perfectly legitimate. I do so as well. But for a strategic reason, I often will focus just on talking about mundane testimony. Although I agree with Plantinga, if Christianity is true, we likely do have something like a census divinitatis, that we are designed just to naturally form beliefs about God. And so when people do form beliefs about God in an automatic way, just like they form beliefs about the external world around them by sense perceiving it, those beliefs can be justified.
Well, and like to even underscore that, when I was, prior to me becoming a Christian, when I called myself an agnostic, and I'm almost every atheist I've ever interviewed or spoken to has some form of testimony like this too, where there were times where I called myself an agnostic, but I found myself talking to God, going like, God, if you hook me up with this girl, I'll forgive you for what you did in high school. Literally, that was the conversation I had in my head with God. So there was like, even as a non-believer, you have these moments where you seem to be engaging or praying or talking to something other than yourself. And that's a common experience, right?
Yes, so different worldviews will interpret that experience differently. So if you are from an atheistic or naturalistic worldview, you will probably interpret that as some sort of fallacy of projection, that we project God onto the universe, back to this Ludwig Feuerbach in the 19th century, saying that we project a heavenly father onto the universe. But if you come from a Christian background, you would say that makes sense from our perspective, because yeah, we are naturally oriented to relate to God and form beliefs in God. And so the way that you describe those beliefs just naturally coming up in the language you use about talking to God is just an expression of the fact that we are homo religiosus, that we are religious meaning-seeking beings, that as Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in the Lord. And so this is just a natural expression of our orientation toward God.
Right. And the atheists in those situations is actually, they're the ones kind of doing the special pleading, because they're going out of the way to discount or dismiss or discredit something that I noticed that I was doing that prior to me becoming a Christian, that there were times where I was like, I would do my own version of the time of crying out to God. And a lot of people have those experiences. That's where the famous phrase comes, there are no atheists in a foxhole. When you get into trouble, it's a natural human thing. There was even this book, Survival in Auschwitz, that I've referenced in some of my videos, where the guy's an atheist, Primo Levi, and he's about to face a selection in Auschwitz, and he knows what it means if he gets chosen, and he starts praying. He says, I'm an atheist. And in that moment, I started praying, and he stops himself because he makes a decision that he doesn't want any part of God, even if God is real. So there's a deliberate, it's almost like in order to dismiss that or discount that, it's like you're actually the one doing the special pleading, or potentially that's an argument. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good example. I wouldn't necessarily myself interpret it as special pleading. The way I would think about it is these are just two different ways, two different worldviews interpreting the same data. So for example, like if you've ever, you've been, let's say you've seen a really bad storm. Here's an example, like specifically back in 1992, I was backpacking through Australia, and I was on the East Coast near Airlie Beach. And so then we were kind of socked into the hostel for a couple of days, because then this cyclone or typhoon, whatever they call them, blew through. And afterwards, the cyclone moved on. And then I walked down to the beach, and the beach was just full of all this stuff that had washed up on shore, but it was like calm, amazingly calm. And I looked across the sky, and I could see the edge of the storm moving on in the distance. And then there was the sunset on one part of the ocean, or I guess it was over the hills, and then the moon rising over the ocean. It's on the East Coast. And then just this stars. Now, a person could look at that, many people could look at that, and they just see, okay, it's just the calm after the storm. For me, it was a spiritual moment. For me, it was Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Went out again.
I wish we had some there we go.
There it is. So Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. That's where you are.
Yeah. So then when that atheist stands on the same beach and they say, well, I just see a nice bucolic setting after a storm, and I'd say, no, God was here. I think that we just have two different interpretations, and one of us is wrong, right? So from my perspective, they're not hearing and seeing something that is there. From their perspective, I'm projecting meaning onto the universe that just is not there and does not exist. And so I don't think either one of them, in my view, is special pleading per se. I think that each one of us is just interpreting the world differently. And it could be that, the reality is true, that if Christianity is true, then I think I did see something that another person just may not have been aware of.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean special pleading in any technical term. I just meant that if you don't have a way of saying that can't be God because I'm an atheist, like there's this atheist, Rene, I told this story a lot of my videos, who when he was like 9 or 10 was in Africa. And he had one of those type of what they call the numinous experience, what you're talking about. And at the time, it's almost normal or natural to go, that's God. Most people who have that experience go, if there is a God, that was God. My sister had one of those experiences when she had just had her first child, when she was sitting on a beach, very similar to what you described, where she just felt this strong sense of peace and connectedness to, looking at her child, and there was a sense of love and gratitude, and this overwhelming feeling took over her. And this was before she became a Christian. And she said, if there is a God, that was God. Do you see what I'm saying? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why the one real insight of Plantinga's epistemology is that as Christians, we don't have to feel that every secularist has to agree with your epistemology. There may be differences in aspects of our epistemology as Christians. So while I recognize that Plantinga began by critiquing the field and developing a theory of proper function, when he gets to a fully robust Christian theology or epistemology, he unapologetically talks about the role of the Holy Spirit and the census divinitatis, because he wants to give a full account of epistemology from a Christian perspective and from what Christians believe to be true.
Right. Well, but that's why it's so. If that was actually God, and there is a God, and those experiences were God, then of course we're rationally justified in believing it. We're perceiving something that actually is, and that can form the basis. Because that's how I became a Christian, I think that can form the basis of a really strong argument. Somewhere buried in there is actually a strong, convincing, compelling argument.
Yeah. So what were you thinking about in particular?
Well, just those experiences are very common. Almost all people have had them. Even what's his face? Christopher Hitchens has described. And now, there are periods where Sam Harris starts talking about that. And he's even gone so far as to say in meditation something along the lines of, if I were raised to know the theology of the Holy Spirit, I would say that was the Holy Spirit, an experience that he had in meditation. So,
well, so
even Sam Harris is a Christian.
back in the 19th century, William James, I think it was the first Gifford lectures that were published of varieties of religious experience, which is so not limited to the Christian tradition. William James was not a Christian or a conventional Christian for sure, but he just surveyed the diversity of ways that people seem to experience the divine. And around that same time, Rudolf Otto published the idea of the holy. And so there's another idea where you look at this idea of holiness, kind of like the cool, right? The holy, analyzing and reifying this concept of some absolute thing. And the two qualities that Rudolf Otto said are possessed by the holy is it attracts and it repels, that you are drawn toward it, but you also kind of shrink back from it. And it's also
the fear
really
of God.
thing.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
And that's how a Christian would analyze it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, a lot of times what I find is scriptures that appear to me sometimes in conversation or when I'm praying or when I'm thinking about something seem almost organic to, that's where my epistemology comes from. It doesn't come from anything other than like, I start having a conversation like this and a scripture will just sort of appear to me and it fits. And I'm like, okay, there you go. Do you know what I mean? Does that?
Yeah. Now that sounds like that's the kind of thing where, again, you don't have to apologize for being a Christian. Think through from the perspective of your beliefs. We shouldn't feel obliged that we have to reason based on the assumptions of another person. So Plantinga, he gives this example where he talks about people who they decide, I want to cut my grass with some scissors rather than a lawnmower. And he says, well, you could do that if you want to, but I'd rather use the lawnmower. And from a Christian perspective, you could develop your epistemology, your apologetic, in a way that kind of denies or sets aside all these things you believe to be true, but that would be like using scissors to cut the grass. So he says, why not just use all the resources that we have available to us as Christians and use the lawnmower?
Now, how revolutionary was Plantinga in terms of his effect? Was there a before Plantinga and after Plantinga? Because there kind of was with some of the other people you mentioned, William James and Rudolf Otto. As far as my understanding of both of those, that book was particularly groundbreaking, and that there was a like before and after with both of those. Was there one with Plantinga?
Let me just say as well, in terms of an equivalent to like William James in our own day, there was a book in 1991 by William Alston, who's related. He was a friendly worker, a co-laborer with the Reformed epistemologists. And so that book was called Perceiving God. And that was a very rigorous attempt to look at religious experience and argue analogously in a way that complemented Plantinga, that you could be properly basic through your religious experience.
That sounds good, actually. I haven't heard of that one. What's the name of that?
Perceiving God.
Okay, I'm definitely going to check that one out.
Yeah, that's a sort of modern classic relating to Reformed epistemology. And in terms of religious arguments from religious experience, Keith Yandel he wrote a book on religious experience and arguing for a transcendent reality from religious experience. So really, we're getting
cut out again. Yeah. Always cuts out the good part.
Yeah, I really think this is a strong marker, since this is where a lot of Christians first get their beliefs as seemingly justified. So
and this is exactly what I wanted to hear from him, because he's really in depth on this.
All right, he's back.
Okay. All right. So I cut out at Keith Yandel? Did you hear about him?
You cut out right when you were telling me about he wrote another book. Keith Yandel is his name?
Keith Yandel. So he did some work on arguments from religious experience. And so it's different than Reformed epistemology, because he's actually arguing not properly basic, but through an argument to the truth of a transcendent reality based upon the fact that people have religious experience. But it's certainly complementary to what Plantinga and the Reformed epistemologists are doing. Now, in terms of Plantinga's impact, I think it was very significant, because when he began working in the 1960s and 70s, the common assumption was that in order to be rational as a Christian, you had to have arguments, and you had to reason to your Christianity as a conclusion to an argument. And he showed that that is in fact not the case, I think.
Right. And that stands to reason, because the reason why I keep going back to it is the time I became a Christian, I went to a church and had a religious experience. That's it. That's what happened. And I was like, wow, this really does seem to me like God. I didn't know any of the arguments and I didn't know any of the objections. Had I, they would have gotten in the way of me actually honestly experiencing what I honestly perceive to be reality. You know what I'm saying? So
yes, yeah,
that's why I think there's a real strong, assuming that you and I are telling the truth and we are perceiving what actually is. I think this is the real pathway towards towards strong argumentation, because if I'm actually perceiving something that is real, then science and philosophy and epistemology, ultimately, if they're in service of the truth, they will be backing me up. They will just be giving me the tools to allow other people to understand that what I'm perceiving is actually real and true, because that's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be in service of the truth. So assuming I am perceiving something that's true, they should all ultimately be backing me up. Right? That's how I see it.
Okay, so two things. Well, one thing I would say is ultimately, yes, but of course, your beliefs may be true, but evidence may arise in the course of investigation that would make them look false. And so it is only with the later provision of all the evidence that we will really finally have the whole picture. Because, for example, if you think how many people have gone to prison and been sentenced based upon some degree of evidence, when in fact they were innocent, and had the availability of all the evidence, we would have known that they were innocent. Right. And so there are times we have to be ready and prepared for that evidence may arise against your beliefs, that even if your beliefs are true, they could appear to be false because we only have a partial picture. So yeah, I think it's an important proviso to have, that we don't have, as the saying goes, the God's eye point of view.
Right. So the other thing I'll throw this out there and see what you say about it. One of the things that I always compare a religious experience to is a headache. A headache, to the person having the headache, it's subjective and internal, and it requires no evidence to the person experiencing the headache. They are experiencing the pain. It's its own evidence. It is, completely self-evident to them. And the difficulty is if somebody comes to me and says, prove to me that you are having a headache, which they wouldn't be motivated to do if I had a headache. But they are, when I say I had an experience with the Holy Spirit, and they say, prove it, but it's subjective and internal. So the difficulty is translating the subjective and internal to the person, to outside of oneself. And you say, what?
Okay, you cut out for the last 10 seconds or so.
But I think
I think I can fill it in. So the thing is that I would say you are definitely, if you seem to be experiencing a headache, then, or you're in pain and it's centered in your head, then yes, you are justified in believing that. Another person as well, again, according to the principle of testimony, which I talked about a few minutes ago, they would be justified in accepting that you were in fact in pain as well.
Right.
Now, I mean, a person may say, okay, but there have to be certain neural synapses firing in your brain in order for you to be in pain. And we're doing a brain scan simultaneous to your claim. And in fact, those neural synapses are not firing. Then they may have what we call a rebutting defeater, a reason to reject your testimony and believe maybe you are lying. But it is still possible, it would seem to me, that that person just doesn't have the full picture, and that, like, even if they don't have the neural correlates of the sensory experience, you could have the sensory experience. And so yes, you can have your internal sensory experience, and in a sense, again, it's indefeasible for you, in the same way that I said, I seem to see a balloon is indefeasible for you. You could not be wrong about that. The challenge comes in moving from that to getting anyone else to accept your experience as veridical.
Yes, that's exactly
the next challenge. So this is why because one thing people always talk about when they first encounter Reformed epistemology is they say, well, then the Mormon who prays and has a burning in the bosom could be justified. And my reaction is yes. I mean, if a Mormon prays after reading the Book of Mormon and they feel a burning in their chest, then all things being equal, they're justified in believing that they had a burning in the chest as a result of the Holy Spirit confirming the truth of the Book of Mormon. What you then do as a Christian apologist is you provide rebutting evidence against the truth of Mormonism to show that Mormonism is false. And once they have a reason to believe Mormonism is false, they now have to reconsider that argument or their experience and think, what are the other explanations for my experience? So in the same way that when you had that religious experience in church, if an apologist could provide a very good argument against the truth of Christianity, that might lead you to now reconsider your experience and consider another natural or some other explanation for it. But until they can provide that defeating evidence, you're justified in accepting your experience.
Well, but also with the Mormon, it gets particularly complex because there's the teachings of the Book of Mormon, but then there's also Mormonism as practiced on the ground floor by actual Mormons. And a lot of them aren't really deviating all that much in their day-to-day from the Bible. And, so it's entirely possible that, like, as practiced by a lot of Mormons, Mormonism is like Christianity light or Christianity alt. It's not necessarily all of the weird, like, some of them probably don't even know half of the Book of Mormon stuff and the golden tablets and all that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's where religious experiences get really, really complex. And you can't be so simplistic in your, like, if you had, one of the things that I point out, tell me if you agree with this. I'm not sure if you will, but you might. So my sister has this experience on a beach, okay, that she believes is God. If she had that experience in India, she is going to automatically ascribe it to the cultural preconditions, like, oh, Shiva was talking to me on that beach. And, you can't see outside the box of your own culture because you don't even know you're in a box. So if she might have had a same experience where, it could actually be someone's genuine census demonitis. But if you're a Hindu person, you have no other tools to explain that to yourself. You're just going to use Hinduism to explain. Does that make sense, what I just said? Do you agree with it?
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I would say that like, if Christianity is true, if God exists, then God can certainly challenge in various ways the assumptions, theological frameworks that people have, and reveal himself in various ways that challenge those frameworks, so that he's not necessarily limited to that. He could say, I'm not Shiva, I'm not Vishnu, I'm not Brahman, I am the Lord or something. And he could kind of break or push out of or move outside of or beyond their theological framework. The other thing is that we're kind of getting into another theological question at this point, which is the relationship between what we call inclusivism and exclusivism. In other words, is God revealed in some way or to some degree through other religious traditions? Does he use those other religious traditions as a way to draw people to himself or not? Does he use other
what do you think
frameworks? On that? Well, I think it's a very complicated question. But I think God does work in many ways, that he's not limited to the Judeo-Christian framework. So, for example, C.S. Lewis, at the end of The Last Battle, he's got this really interesting provocative section where you have Aslan, the Christ figure, and then you have a guy in the story named Emeth. Emeth is Hebrew for truth, and Emeth was worshiping another god, Tash, rather than Aslan. But it turns out that he was worshiping Aslan in virtue of worshiping Tash, because he didn't really know Aslan. And then So Emeth says to Aslan, so are you and Tash the same? And Aslan kind of growls threateningly and essentially says, no, we are as different as like the morning and the evening sun or whatever. Like, we're just, we're polar opposites. But nonetheless, in your inadequacies, that which you offered essentially to Tash, I took as offered to me. You could kind of think about that in terms of Romans chapter 2, verse 12. So, and following.
Or what about, I was thinking John 10. How do you interpret John 10 with the other sheep?
That's another. I mean, that's of course sort of been interpreted in various ways, but one way some people have interpreted that certainly is a reminder that God's revelation is not limited to this group right here. Now, in terms of the, I would say that I think the primary focus there, however, would be the inclusion of Gentiles is really perhaps the drift of that passage.
Okay, interesting.
But Romans 2:12, so Paul is saying that each individual, Jew and Gentile, is judged on the light they've been given. So if they have one particular understanding of God, then they're judged on that light. If they have another understanding of God, they're judged on that fuller light. And so if you're a Jew who has the law of God, or if you're a Gentile who's...
Uh-oh. I thought we were free. I thought we were finally free of cutting outs.
Is he back? I think so.
Not yet.
Yeah, I'm back.
Jew or Gentile law of God. That's where you cut out on.
Yes. So then God is judging each individual relative to the degree of light they've been given, and so then you could say, if one person, they relate to God under some inadequate false label, false understanding, well, they could nonetheless be relating to God in that way. Now, Christians often, conservative Christians push back on that by using a couple texts. And one of them is John 14, where Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, verse 8. And then Acts 4:12, there's no other name under heaven by which you are saved, but the name of Jesus alone. But this is not questioning those passages, because those passages talk about the fact that ultimately all are saved through Christ. The question is, how is Christ come to people? How does he come to people in the world? And does he come to people through the inadequacies of their particular cultural, contextualized theological understanding? And that's another question. I
remember when I was a New Age person, I was like, when I was in my mid-20s, I was looking for God and I was reading all this New Age stuff. And I was starting to become intellectually convinced that there was a God. And so what you just said makes sense to me completely in that context, because it's like, it's hard to explain off the top of my head. But this takes us right to progressive versus conservative, because you put out videos on that Christianity-wise. You put out a video on that topic too, because we're almost out of time before we take questions. So
yeah,
what do you want to say on that before we? Because that was thorough on the epistemology. That was awesome. So we'll move on to
progressive versus conservative.
Well, in terms of Christianity, you were commenting on the Elisa Childers, I think her name is. She used to be in Zoe Girl, and you had stuff to say on that.
Let me just say this about progressive versus conservative labels. So first of all, people from a conservative background often think, oh, it's the liberal or the progressive who's sort of putting their neck out and taking a risk because they're changing something that we've long accepted to be true. And what I would simply like to point out is that very often, in fact, the things that were changed should have been changed. So if you went back in a time machine to the 1940s and you went to a church in the American South, probably it's a segregationist church, and it has a segregationist theology that affirms Jim Crow and the separation of races, and it theologically justifies that. If you went back in time another decade or two earlier, that church may have been complicit in the lynching of people. Of course, lynching was there's been, I think, 3,000, 4,000 Black people that were lynched in the American South in the Jim Crow era. Extraordinary, horrible. And you think the vast majority of people that were doing the lynching thought of themselves as good Christians, and they thought of themselves as the conservatives. And it was the liberals who were, the progressives that wanted to integrate the races and were teaching at all the liberal schools in the Northeast. But we look back now and we say, hey, on that question, the liberals were the right.
Oh, you cut out. Right? Liberals were.
And we're actually getting some questions in the chat too.
Well, we're gonna move on to questions after he gives a little spiel on this. I just want, because it's on his video, I just wanted him to give his piece.
Okay, so did I cut out again then?
Yeah, you cut out on liberals. You were basically saying that back then the liberals were on the right side of history. They would have been in favor of civil rights and
yeah. So I mean, it's just a reminder that being conservative doesn't mean you have the safer position. It doesn't mean the liberal is the one taking the risk. The liberal or the progressive may be on the right side of history. Yeah, remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous statement, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice.
Right.
And so that bending is itself a challenging of the status quo. So being conservative doesn't automatically make you right. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the conservatives are right and the liberals have tossed the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. But we just need to get rid of the stigma that one of those two labels is the suspicious one, and they may both have insights.
I tend to agree. There's probably both. There's probably times where I go towards both, depending on what's the topic being discussed and, what's being talked about. But I think we got some questions that John's going to give you from the chat.
Sure.
All right. Yeah. And by the way, thanks, Randal, for doing this.
Yeah, of course.
I always check out all the conversations that you post up on your blog, and it's so cool to see how many that you're doing and actually interacting with. A lot of small-time YouTubers like us just trying to get some more insight into Reformed epistemology and all the many types of apologetics that you go through. So,
my pleasure.
We have a question from Jonathan Depew. What are some of the things in Colin Gunton's life and work that has impacted your thinking the most? And I guess Colin was your doctoral advisor.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, Colin, he was a great guy. So I worked with him from the year 1999 to 2002 when I moved back to Canada, and he died unexpectedly in May of 2003. He was, I think, 63 at the time. He was just beginning his major work, his systematic theology, when he passed away. So that was really unfortunate. But I first got into his theology at Regent College in the late 1990s, and that's what drew me to study under him in England. And what I appreciated about him was he's very culturally engaged. So he's not a very careful thinker in some ways, but he was a very interesting thinker, and he thought to bring a lot of ideas together and get other people thinking in new ways, and to engage with theology and philosophy and history and culture. And I really was intrigued by that theological vision. So that actually had a big impact on me. In fact, I have a essay coming out in a forthcoming book with T&T Clark on Gunton's theology as well. So yes, he continues to have an impact on me. Very well worth reading as a theologian.
Yeah, we're looking forward to reading that essay then. There's a question from Salem, and it actually ties into a question I had regarding the evolutionary argument against naturalism. I was wondering if, so the argument goes that it is more plausible that we would have rational faculties under theism than under naturalism, because naturalism would provide us, or would be just as likely to provide us with false beliefs, but adaptive beliefs rather than true but adaptive beliefs. Or rather, it could be even more likely that we get false beliefs, just given the fact that there's more false beliefs than true beliefs that are adaptive. The question I had was regarding would it technically be the case that it would be more likely that we would have more true beliefs or more reliable faculties under Christianity, given that the theological doctrine of the fall and the fact that man has a sinful nature and will be led more towards false things, and then will still propagate the species in ways that could affect the faculties of the future generations. Just your thoughts on that, I guess.
So one of the ways that people who object to the evolutionary argument against naturalism is to argue this sort of tu quoque. Tu quoque is a term that means essentially same to you, or that happens to you just as well. So the naturalist, one way to argue from their perspective is to say, well, If you think that I can't have justified belief, neither can you, because you have a doctrine of the fall. And so you don't know that your cognitive faculties have not been distorted to the fact that you can't have knowledge or justified belief. And you could even go further if you went into the realm of skeptical theism. So for those who are familiar with skeptical theism, anyway, the idea here is that God may have morally sufficient reasons we cannot imagine to allow all of our beliefs to be false, essentially like Descartes' evil demon. And God has good reasons for allowing us to have virtually all of our beliefs being false. And if we can't know that that's not a reasonable possibility, then we have an undercutting defeater to accept any of our beliefs as true. So yes, those would be some ways of that one might try to spin that back. I mean, I don't, for me, in terms of like the way I deal.
Oh. It's frustrating because we see his mouth moving, but no, are you back?
Yeah, it happened a lot.
Yeah, it seems like he can hear us, but are you still?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
So did you get what I said anyway about skeptical theism?
Yes, you're just bringing that up. Skeptical. Yeah.
Okay, so the way that I'd respond to the skeptical theist, and then I'll kind of back through to all these other issues, is to say that to me, it's not an issue simply raising it as a possibility. It becomes an issue when it becomes a relatively high significant level possibility, right? And so it's not merely that God might have reasons, it's that we have some good reason to think he's done that. And I don't think we do. In fact, certainly from a Christian perspective, revelation is very important. And so if you accept a Christian perspective, then relative to that perspective, God is going to want us to have some ability to rationally process and gain true beliefs and knowledge about the world. And indeed, God wants to have a relationship with us, and having knowledge and true beliefs is pivotal to having relationship. So God would ensure that we have that. So if you have that picture of who God is, then you'd have a good background framework in order to be rationally trusting our cognitive faculties. But when it comes to naturalism, yeah, the problem comes back that not that I mean, for Plantinga, one key thing is that it's not that it's likely that our beliefs are going to be producing false deliverances, our cognitive faculties will produce false beliefs, but rather it's either highly likely or it's just inscrutable. In other words, that we would have no way to know either way. I mentioned earlier William Alston, right? The book Perceiving God. He also wrote a book in the mid-90s called The Reliability of Sense Perception. And this is another interesting one because it sort of complements Plantinga here. That the point that Alston makes is that you can't show independently of sense perception that sense perception is reliable. Excuse me. So the only way to know, to rationally believe sense perception is reliable is to start off with that as a justified assumption. You can't step out of your sense perception to show that it's reliable. And he sort of has this 150-page book arguing this, I think, quite well. And so then the point is, well, then you really need a worldview that can justify sense perception as providing true beliefs and not simply adaptive beliefs. And so that's definitely where I think theism would have an advantage.
Let me ask you. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to think that could then be used as since the evolutionary argument against naturalism isn't really an argument against naturalism, but rather an argument against the justification in belief in naturalism. Whereas using that sort of starting point, that could then be utilized as an actual argument, I think, against naturalism, given the fact that we need to rely upon our sensory faculties in order to get anywhere off of the ground. Then we have a reason to reject naturalism in some.
Yeah. So if you believe that you have knowledge or true beliefs, then that's a rebutting defeater to naturalism, because you couldn't have that knowledge or true beliefs based upon naturalism.
Right, because they wouldn't be justified.
Yeah, and so you'd actually have an argument against the truth of naturalism, but yes, you'd also have an argument against the rationality of belief in naturalism. So yeah, I think you'd have both.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
How influenced are you by, you said you were a Calvinist for a period of time? Are you somewhat influenced by Calvinists, like the what's it called? The tulip, the total depravity, that people can't really perceive God because of sin. Does that still influence you at all?
So I accept total depravity from a Protestant perspective, but from an Arminian perspective rather than a Calvinist one. So
Arminian as in accepting free will rather than the sort of theological determinism of Calvinism. I think he's back now.
Is he? No, I think he's gone. I think he was about to explain what he meant.
All right, we're back now.
Yes, yeah. You're just saying from an Armenian perspective rather than
So I think total depravity is not owned by Calvinists, but some Calvinists have a more dour perspective of the impact of sin on our cognitive faculties. So and that would not be me, but I do think that certainly worldview impacts the way you reason. Now that's probably getting into another topic now, but yes, I would accept total depravity. Yeah.
All right. And we've got a question from Salem or Inspiring Christianity on Twitter. Besides Alvin Plantinga, is there any other author or books that you would suggest on God being a properly basic belief?
It's been, the first thing I would say is it's been a little while since I've read in the area. I haven't kept up in the literature on that area in the last 12 years or so, probably. Mm-hmm. So some of my references I think would be a little dated, but in terms of that kind of non-foundationalist epistemology, or I'm sorry, a moderate foundationalist epistemology, I think Michael Bergman's done some really good work. In terms of a general, probably one book that I'd recommend, which is going back about 20 years, but it was written by Robert Audi, and it's called Epistemology, and it's a Rutledge introduction to epistemology, but from a moderate foundationalist perspective. So he's actually, Robert Audi is a Christian philosopher. That doesn't come through at all in the book.
Right.
I think he gives a very good foundation for just, no pun intended, a good foundation for understanding moderate foundationalist epistemology as a way of thinking, and a good complement then to Plantinga. So I would probably recommend Audi's book, Epistemology.
That's good to hear. I'm actually reading that book right now. I'm probably only about like 25 pages into it, but it's still, it's extensive. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole Rutledge series, it's been a while since I read it, but I've read most of them and I found them quite good.
Yeah. Yeah. I also have his other book, Moral Knowledge and Ethical Character, that I'm looking forward to reading as well.
Right.
All right. We have a question from Ethan Silva. What do you think about classical theism, such as like defended by Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, it's there's some things I like in classical theism and other things not. So I think people often, like, classical theism really is a system that you either sort of buy into the whole thing or you don't. And so really committed to a strong doctrine of divine simplicity, for example, of atemporality, of impassibility. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, I've got a lot of problems with a lot of those different doctrines. I believe God is temporal rather than atemporal. I don't think of time as a created thing that God is subject to, but I do think that God is temporal. It exists through time rather than outside of time. I don't think of God as simple in some of the ways that people like Aquinas did, where he talked about God's essence is to exist. I can't make a lot of sense myself of those concepts. So I tend to be somewhat of a critic of a lot of aspects of skeptical theism. I do talk a lot about being a perfect being theist. I think that's maybe a more helpful way to think about things, coming from an Anselmian perspective, not buying into some of Anselm's classical theism, but thinking through the intuition of God being that than which none greater can be conceived, and sort of going there in developing your theological model through the idea of perfection.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm just curious from the aspect of God being temporal rather than atemporal. Is that affected at all, or does the findings in like the theory of relativity affect that at all, or is this sort of referencing something further than just like the time as a fourth dimension of space, but rather like metaphysical time or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would think that in a kind of absolute now, in a Newtonian sense, and no, I don't think Einstein has shown that metaphysical time is wrong, that it doesn't exist, because what Einstein has shown is that our experience of time is conditioned by space. But he hasn't shown that there isn't an absolute temporal now. He's only shown that accessible to creatures within the universe, time is affected by space, by gravity, mass, and so on. So, see, I don't see there being a problem with having a Newtonian absolute now.
Okay, so like you might accept that like God isn't like some sort of physical matter in a sort of a Einsteinian conception of time as like the fourth dimension, but rather God is still within metaphysical time, and then there's the sort of actual localized time, I guess, that Einstein's theory of relativity sort of shows us.
Essentially, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I had another question from Salem. For somebody who is likely going to study history and philosophy in university, what suggestions and things to do would you suggest to me going into this? Yeah.
History
and philosophy. Yeah. He's a Christian.
Well, I mean, one thing is to read widely. So, and that's one of the great things of, like, I have great respect for autodidacts, for people who are self-taught, but generally one of the downsides is they only read in their interests, and so they don't get exposed to a broader system of thinking. And so that's a good thing about a university education, is it forces you to read more widely. And I would say be intentional about continuing that. So read widely. Try to read literature as well. I have an undergraduate degree in English literature, and so thinking through story and narrative is certainly a complement to philosophy and theology, and certainly history as well. So that the more that you can be broadened in your scope of interests, the more you will find all sorts of mutual contact points emerging between these different ideas and experiences. So for example, one really big piece of philosophical thinking is the thought experiment. Well, if you explore novels, stories, short stories, you have endless horizons for thought experiments. Anybody who's a fan of a Christopher Nolan film, right? There's all sorts of stuff in there about being, identity, time, free will, all of those kinds of concepts, they emerge through story. And so expose yourself to all sorts of ideas and culture, and that you'll just find you'll be enriched immeasurably in your own thinking.
Right. Yeah, and it's a good point to actually exploring into fiction as well, because you sort of have a lot more freedom to actually convey ideas in a different way than you would just reading purely nonfiction work.
Yes.
Also, lay people, the people who are self-taught, that you see that a lot on YouTube, is that they don't know where they don't know things because they don't have a broad enough understanding of, like, so you see that all the time in YouTube debates where there are people who are really sharp, but they don't have a broad enough understanding. So they'll just assert wildly, inaccurately, and they don't know that they're doing it. You see that constantly on YouTube.
Yeah, yes. The whole Dunning-Kruger effect that you can find. Yeah. All right. I had another question regarding, since you brought up the perfect being theology. I was curious, since I had heard before in one of your recent debates that within your understanding, God is analytically equivalent to the good. I'm wondering if having like, does that then make it almost trivially true to say that God is good, to like the character of God is good, because that's just the character of God? And so it's like, doesn't even make sense really to say God is good or God is the best being out there if what we mean by best is just godlike.
Yes. So there's one of the tensions there, right? Is that when you want to talk about figuring out what the concept of God is, you start with an external concept of the good, and then you want to measure God up to that and make sure God measures up to that. But the whole time we were measuring our concept of God up to God. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of well, the one thing I would say is that there are some philosophers like Richard Swinburne who do distinguish the good from God, and so talk about God is distinct from the good, and so you do avoid some of those problems. And so You could have a view like that. You could be a Platonist. You could think of there as an absolute good, and then God exemplifies the good perfectly, distinct from anyone else. He is the one particular exemplification of the universal abstract of the good. And you could just avoid all those problems. The reason that Christians kind of don't want to go that route is because of a very deep aseity intuition. So this idea that, well, if God is truly perfect and maximally great, then there should be nothing outside of God that is sort of the final endpoint to anything. And so we must find a way to identify God with the good itself. And so that's where the aseity intuition comes from. You don't have anything external to God. But you do have to be careful about the way that you measure, that you describe it, in order that you avoid those kinds of self-reference problems. So yeah, it could be a challenge. One way to think about it is that we use the word God in different ways, right? So that we don't, when we use the word God, we use it as a title, we use it as a proper name, and you always have to be careful about how you are using the term God. But I think ultimately what you could discover is that the whole thing that you were talking about is ultimately the divine nature, but you were talking about the divine nature conceptually as something abstract or distinct from God, even though it is just God. But because of our limited human minds, we just think about it as distinct from God. Kind of like if you think about putting glasses on, and you take these glasses off and these things, they pull apart, but when you put the glasses on, they collapse together again into one three-dimensional image. I'm thinking like the blue and red, those 3D glasses, or something like that. I'm just trying to spitball here with an analogy. Is like we think about these things as distinct, God and the good, but in fact, if you put the glasses on and see, they are one and the same thing. But conceptually, we can still think of them with the glasses off as a part, and then make sure that our concept of God matches up with the reality of God, even though metaphysically the good just is the nature of God. But yeah,
right. And I think there's other way, a couple other ways that you can kind of think of it as well, where in our analysis of what the good is, like even sort of like not even thinking about whether God is the good or not, actually just trying to understand what would be the good, what would be like the most good, and what sorts of powers would the good have. And so if it even has powers, like if the good is purely an abstract concept, then, and especially a non-natural abstract concept, then it would seem like we would have no way of actually perceiving things to be good or not, unless we had some sort of like Platonic rational intuition to kind of work, to remember the good or something like that. And so it seems like if we want to say that, okay, we do have knowledge of the good or things being good, then we have to have some sort of way in which we can interact with the good. And so it would seem like, since we're not the ones producing it ourselves, that the good is like in a way imposing itself into our awareness or something like that. And from there, perhaps we can elaborate or discover that when we're referring to the good, we're actually referring to an actual being with causal powers and the ability to exemplify like all of these maximally good traits that we would typically imagine, like all loving, all knowing, all powerful, those types of things. And then from there, like, okay, now that we have a firm understanding of what the good is, we do see that what we commonly understood as God is actually equivalent with the good, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, maybe trivial like the morning and evening star, right? We think that they're completely different bodies, but we're seeing the same thing under a different description.
Right. So. I had a question from Gavin. Can you comment on the American Physiological Association, a secular organization, including transcendence as one of the 6 ultimate human virtues? I don't know if you're aware of that inclusion or not.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
But interesting, though.
Well, certainly, but transcendence is such a woolly term. It can mean many different things. But I guess Walker Percy, a famous Christian writer, he famously said that human beings are the only creatures that get bored. Like other animals will get bored if you put them like in a cage, but if you leave them in their natural environments, then they they never get bored. Like a dog or, you know, a wolf in the woods, they never like, there's nothing to do today, right? But human beings, they get bored. There's Christians often show this video. I think it's quite poignant. It's an interview of Tom Brady back in 2005 on 60 Minutes, where he's talking about how he had just won 2 or 3 Super Bowls. And then he says, is this all it is? Isn't there anything else? And he had everything, and yet he was bored. And I think that's where you're really getting into the concept of transcendence, that something, it pushes us to something beyond ourselves. And it in fact, many Christians have used this as an argument for something transcendent like God. So C.S. Lewis was one of the few modern philosophers, Peter Kreeft, following on with Lewis, to develop an argument for desire, from desire for God. So this idea being that whenever you have these innate impulses, so basic impulses, so food, drink, relationship or sex, intimacy, breathing, like air, those are all things that can be fulfilled. They all have a way to be fulfilled. But we also have some deep impulse for something more, which we would say is the divine, the transcendent. And that suggests that that's an argument that there is such a thing that corresponds to that desire or drive as well. So I think that transcendence is pretty significant then.
It wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be there if there wasn't sort of some innate yearning in a human being.
Yes. Yeah.
Let me ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, because this is going to shift gears.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always found that argument to be quite fascinating, and I think deeply tied to a reason for why a lot of Christians become Christian. And I think while it doesn't get much play, I see it all within apologetics. I think there could be some ways in which to sort of like at least give it a little bit more plausibility, especially since I think a lot of like naturalists would sort of assume that, okay, this is just some sort of desire that's heritable. And then like, because boredom is maladaptive, there has to be this seeking for more. And that's why like you had this sort of Freudian, I don't know, within Freud's work, he sort of makes this case that you have this innate wanting for anything just to keep you in motion. And that's sort of like the Darwinian example. I think there's a way to still utilize sort of Darwinian theory in relation to the argument from desire. That like, what is it? Darwin, he made a case for, like, he had seen a certain type of flower that had a really deep throat for where the pollen was. And so from seeing that, he recognized that, okay, the only reason that this flower would have developed this adaptation would be if there is some like another organism that has some like long tongue or something like that. And I think in his studies, he never found the matching organism to that. But it was discovered later on that there was indeed, I think, some bird.
Yes,
maybe it was a moth.
It's like a very long beak or something. I've read about that. Yeah. Yeah,
and it's only that type of bird that is like matched to this specific type of flower. And so I think there could be a case that could be made that if there is some sort of evolved trait within humans, within human organisms, that is both costly, like it actually had to expend some amount of energy and calories in order to develop, and it's still repetitive, like in continuing the species, then I think there could be a case to say that there is this adaptation within human beings for this desire for the divine. And then from that, you could maybe make some sort of like argument from probability regarding there being some sort of matching correspondence to the divine to meet this desire. But I don't know. I'm sure there's quite a few different ways in which that could be attacked still within Darwinism. But I at least find it an interesting sort of case.
Yeah, it's an intriguing field to be thinking about for sure. I think that often those kinds of arguments, they don't get a lot of attention often. Like everyone wants to talk about design arguments or cosmological arguments. But I think for many people, those kinds of desire experiences, maybe not yet put into a formal argument, but that those are very transformative for them. And so it'd be nice if there was more focus on them in contemporary apologetics.
I'd also say like existentialist arguments as well. I hear from a lot of people that realizing there being no meaning in life was what led them to realize that, okay, well, there has to be something, because I had this, and it's probably tied to the argument from Desire that I had this need for meaning. Otherwise, there's no point in existing. And so, like, I have some point in existing, therefore there must be meaning, and there must be some sort of transcendent source of this meaning.
Yeah.
As the argument might go. All right, go ahead, Craig.
Oh, now I'm torn because I don't know if I want to keep going with this or shift gears. How much time do you have left, Mr. Rauser?
I got around 15 minutes, maybe.
Okay, so then I'll shift gears because actually that was pretty interesting. I could have gone with that. In debates, you've done a pretty decent amount of debates over the years. Yes, no.
Yeah, I've probably done around 30, maybe something like that, in various formats.
Wow. Are most of them on YouTube? Are they available?
Well, like, for example, I've done 8 on Unbelievable, the British radio show. I've probably done around 12 or 10 that are live. Some that most were formal, but some sort of informal dialogue debates. And then a lot of YouTube and stuff. So yeah, most of those, well, probably half, I would say, would be available online.
Mm-hmm.
So what was
I know recently you had like a couple conversations with Eric Murphy with Talk Heathen, sort of going over both the moral argument and the argument for moral epistemology.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about those kinds of things because those are just more conversational. But I've also done a lot of events like that as well. And honestly, like I mean, debates are fine and that, but I tend to prefer the conversations more because when debates, everybody's kind of like, you're in debate mode, right? And
isn't that the gist of Talk Heathen? Aren't they like? Isn't it supposedly more of a conversational show where you can call up a few times and go into longer form? How did those go? Should we check those out? I didn't even know you did that.
Yeah, that's on Eric's personal channel. So I think I did 3 of them. We were going to do just one, but we never got to the topic each week, which was like God and morality, I think. And so we had to keep adding an hour. Eventually had like just over 3 hours of content. It was good, very good. Enjoyed it.
I'll actually try to get him on here. I didn't even realize you had done those. And what about the Dillahunty T-Jump debate? What comments do you have about that?
I find that kind of frustrating, to be honest. I mean, they're nice guys. Tom especially seems like a very nice guy. I don't really know Matt. I've been on Tom's show a couple times. But I mean, those are the examples where Tom's clearly self-taught and not familiar with a lot of the broader fields of the areas he's talking about. So he kind of makes these off-the-wall statements about, I can't remember now, but something like, there are no arguments or no evidence at all for theism or something. And where do you go with that? I mean, it's when you kind of have those extreme statements at the beginning, it really puts you back on your heels, because then you got to go through so much in terms of laying foundations, explaining what evidence is, what a good argument would look like, what rationality is. You can spend your whole time just laying a foundation to rebut what is truly an extraordinary statement. So,
right. Well, that's one of there's the famous thing that William Lane Craig won't debate people who don't have advanced degrees. And I think there's a reason for that, because there's a bunch of smarty pants atheists who could actually make him inauthentically, put him in a gotcha position, because they're not unwittingly, they don't know enough in the field. So they'll be like, boulderizing topics and like, basically getting all these things wrong, and they'll like have a gotcha moment, but it's an inauthentic one because they've just run roughshod over 100 years of philosophy. You can kind of get away with that in philosophy because there's a lot of BS involved, or there's a lot of, what sounds convincing is convincing. Whereas you couldn't do that in science. You could never back somebody into a corner who's well versed in science, or you probably couldn't do it in history as easily either.
Well, I mean, I would say similarly in science, I think most biologists will not debate young earth creationists.
For that reason.
For some of the same reasons. And I mean, and it's the same dynamic with Jesus mythicists, right? No academic is a Jesus mythicist. I mean, you can say, well, you have Robert Price and Richard Carrier has a PhD in classics, but these are a couple outliers, and they're both militant atheists.
Yeah.
So that's not particularly impressive. Like, we're still talking about 99% plus of people who are trained in classics and ancient history and biblical studies believe Jesus existed. And so it's a challenge. Like, do you give a platform, and thus by implication give authenticity to your substance to what are truly extraordinary positions?
They were just debating that on Twitter. Actually, John, and if he's still in the audience, I believe him and his wife were just having a mythicist argument for like the last 2 days on Twitter. Laura Robinson with a carrier acolyte.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. It was very interesting, because that was one of her frustrations, is that she was saying something along the lines of what you're saying. The thing about Carrier is he's a known entity in the atheist community, but in terms of as a historian, his position is really, really, really it's not an established position at all. So he's
Yeah, so you can get a really distorted picture, right? If people are only exposing themselves to this loud conspiracy theory voices in whatever it is, whether it's young earth creationism or Jesus mythicism or anti-vaxxers or whatever it is, climate change deniers. I mean, I would say that in any one of those cases, the minority voice could be right, of course.
Right. That's the same justification they said.
Yeah.
Like, just because it's not the standard position, they could still be right. But you have to have really, if it's not the consensus position in something like history or science, you have to have really compelling evidence or go away. It's got to be a really good reason. You can't just be like, and as far as I can see in the mythicists, there isn't really any groundbreakingly compelling reason for us to think that the minority are right on this one. You know what I'm saying? That's how I see it.
Yeah.
How do you see it? Probably the same, I guess.
Yeah. I find that they're just making many moves, one after another. Like, oh well, Josephus didn't really say the whole Testimonium Flavianum is an interpolation. I mean, people don't, like, vast majority of historians don't believe that. They believe and I agree with this. It's far more plausible to believe that Josephus originally included a statement about Jesus as a historical figure. Yes, I think that there are added interpolations into it, probably put there by Eusebius, but to say that the whole thing was dropped in there is just not plausible.
Right.
So, so just one after another, you look at all of these arguments, they look very strong on the face of it, but if you take the time to go back and look at each one of them in detail, there's really not a strong case at all.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. You can get away with that. You can get away with that with history in ancient history a little. You can't get away with it in modern history because everybody has enough grounding in the facts. You can get away with it on YouTube and Twitter, make stupid statements about like Hitler being a Christian and stuff. But you can't really get away with it in any convincing way. And you can get away with it in philosophy a little, but you can't I guess you're saying the young earth creationists do get away with it in science to a little bit of a degree. But
yeah, well, I'll tell you one kind of off the wall story as we wrap up here. And my first year attending an academic conference of the Evangelical Theological Society was in 2002 in Colorado, and I went to a particular room to hear a guy deliver a paper, and there had been a room change, so it was a different speaker. So I thought, I'll just listen to this guy. And it turned out the guy was a historian and he was a Holocaust denier. And gradually people are like listening, because like the ETS, in order to be a member of ETS, you have to sign a statement that you believe in the doctrine of the Trinity and the inerrancy of the Bible. But they don't, fortunately, they don't force you to accept a definition of inerrancy. So I could sign off on that. And so this guy could sign off on that because he also denied the Holocaust. And so there was, as you can imagine, a pretty big pushback in the room to his ideas. But I'm like thinking my introduction to ETS 18 years ago was a Holocaust denier. It's pretty bizarre.
Wow. So what's if people were to search out your debates, what are some ones that we should look up that you would want people to go check out? Any ones that come to mind?
Well, yeah, I would. the one that I did on the radio, which I enjoyed a few years ago, was the Devil's Advocate debate with Michael Roos, and that was on Unbelievable. So I argued for atheism, he argued for Christianity. I've done a couple other Devil's Advocate debates recently as well.
Yeah, I noticed you've done like 3 or 4 of those recently.
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah, so those are good. I enjoyed them. And then I've written 3 books, 2 books that are debate books, one with John Loftus and another one was The Atheist and the Christian Walk Into a Bar with Justin Schieber. And so Schieber and I, one of the events that we did that I quite enjoyed was a Q&A at a large church in East Edmonton, here where I live. There's probably about 800 people were there on a Saturday night. And that was fantastic to have an atheist answering questions in there. And so again, like that wasn't a debate so much as we were just answering questions, but that was a very enjoyable event. That's available on YouTube. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, of course, if people just kind of search, then they'll come up with many.
And don't you normally post them on your blog as well? So
yes,
if anyone wants to look
but I've got, but I don't have them grouped all into one place, so they may be hard to find if you look at my blog, because I've got 10 years of articles and things, 2,500 of them on my blog.
10 years in the trenches, John. 10 years in the trenches.
That's it.
All right. I had like one last question. There was something you had said almost offhandedly in one of your conversations that for you it seemed that it was more plausible. The existence of evil was more plausible under theism than under naturalism. So for you, the problem of evil, even though you regularly use the problem of evil in your Devil's Advocate debates quite amazingly as well, what you had said there was that it seemed more plausible under theism than naturalism. Can you elaborate on that? Or unless I'm misremembering.
The existence of moral value. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And so if you want to talk about evil, that would be the presence of disvalue, right, in a situation. And that's a little different than suffering, because you could have suffering in a world with no objective moral value or disvalue. You still have suffering, clearly. And so when it comes to arguing for the existence of suffering in the world, like you could do it by way of suffering and not address moral value at all, or you could do it through moral value and disvalue.
Right. You could probably use it rather than attacking God's goodness, rather attacking his all-lovingness. And so like an all-loving being would not allow for creatures of such and such a kind to suffer these immense amounts of suffering. But,
so can you give me the question again?
Right. How under naturalism, the existence of evil is less probable than under theism. I think that's how I recall you.
I'm not sure if I use that, because that's more of a Bayesian framing. Right. I generally don't use a Bayesian framing. Bayesian framing. But sorry, I just got to close something there. But in terms of for me, it's naturalism. Well, okay, naturalism is one thing, atheism is another thing.
Right.
So in terms of naturalism, everything that exists is either nature, it's natural, or it supervenes on that which is natural. Now, there are different definitions of natural or of naturalism, but generally, maybe it's something like, well, one way to put it is whatever exists is described by a hypothetically complete science. So whatever a perfect science ends up describing is that which exists. And so then the question would be, could you ever have a science of morality where you could describe moral facts in the same way that you can describe natural facts, so that moral facts are indeed just reducible to natural facts? And that seems to me very implausible, that morality and the existence of moral value is just a different kind of thing than that which is natural and studied by science. And so if that which is natural is all that exists, then you can't really have objective moral value. It doesn't exist.
Suppose, though, that you took, say, a Sam Harris sort of approach and say there's ethical naturalism, that there are certain states of affairs that, like, a brain state of positive ecstasy would be something that we would qualify as good. And so when you have, say, 100 million brains all experiencing that same sort of brain state, we can say that that is a good world, especially compared to some like alternate world in where all these brains are instead experiencing whatever brain state of suffering might be, like
But that person ends up doing then is simply identifying the good with pleasure. And so it's in a sort of utilitarian way. And so, well, why don't we just identify the good with pleasure? And well, first of all, I would want to pick apart that definition. I think that's a very reductionist definition of what the good is, to say it's simply brains undergoing pleasure states, as if the most morally virtuous person is a brain hooked up into a vat having orgiastic experiences endlessly. I think that doesn't strike me as a very high view of moral nobility. But beyond that, I think that what that person is doing is simply really begging the question by saying, we're just going to talk about descriptive facts as if they are normative. Right. And so we're just going to treat brain states undergoing pleasure as a moral good. But in fact, you haven't shown that that's all moral goods are. What you've simply said is, we're not going to actually talk about moral goods. We're just going to talk about natural facts of pleasure as if they are moral goods.
Well, I think that would have to be the only avenue you would be able to take if you're trying to talk about some sort of science of morality. Because, like, if you're trying to conform all normative sort of oughts and normative terms within a scientific sort of descriptive sense, then yeah, the best you can be left with is probably these descriptions of brain states or something like that.
I think that's true, but I think what that does is just show the inadequacy of that account of morality.
Right.
Uh-oh, that hasn't happened in a while.
Yeah. You're doing pretty good. All right. Are you back? I think so. Yeah, you were just saying how that just points out how it's an inadequate accounting of morality, in that it's leaving out all sorts of normative. And then so the last thing is that it also is trying to talk about moral good or moral value, disvalue, but not about moral obligation, which is something else entirely. Right.
Why ought you to do X rather than Y? And so I also think that moral obligation, the best account of moral obligation, is one that ties in an agent to whom we are obliged, who has issued a command. And so I think the best account for obligation is that there is a transcendent individual of moral perfection who has the authority to issue the commands that become obligatory for us as he issues them, so that the theist has a definite leg up when it comes to explaining moral obligation, which really is the foundation of morality. Morality is not just a cataloging of that which is of value and disvalue, but how we ought to act or live and how we're obliged to live.
Right.
So yeah. Okay, go
ahead. Craig, did you want to say anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think we're good. There's no burning question in the chat. So he said he had about 15 minutes left, and that was about 25 minutes ago. So I think we can let him escape our clutches.
Excellent.
So You saw it here, guys. Last week I barbecued the dry apologist. This week we destroy Randal Rauser. Yes. And there's no mercy, no quarter taken. This is the graveyard where the Christian apologist comes to be demolished. You saw it here live, folks. Go tell your friends. Never seen anything like that on YouTube to this day. And Randal, did you want to say anything? I thought it was a great conversation. I wanted to focus mostly on the Reformed epistemology because I knew you knew a decent amount about it that you could teach. That you could teach us.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yes, my theology and apologetics lie in smoking ruins at the end of this almost 2-hour exchange. So now I'm going to go and shiver in the corner.
You were on Stephanie's channel, and both of you are professors, and it shows because it's the same thing with both of you. Like, I don't even really need to be here. I could just say like, Planager, and you'll go like, okay, well, and you could just keep going and going. Like it shows you're actually lecturing as a professor, right?
Yeah,
it shows it because the same thing with Stephanie. You don't need to do anything except prompt her, and she can talk for she'll just give you a thorough. You did the exact same thing. I didn't even need to I could say a word. So then Planager did what? And you go, okay, so Reformed epistemology. So, but then we had to destroy you.
That was it was fun while it lasted anyway.
Yes.
All right, guys.
Thank you very much, Randal.
You bet.
All right.
Take care.
And ending the stream.
And that is all.
Yep.
Are we all fair?